Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a sneak peek of the CRPNA's new softcover book, Burlington's Spectacular STEAM Program. I'm Lisa Hardy. I am the program administrator for the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Don't you love opening the pages of a new book for the first time? That initial crackling of the cover, followed by feeling the page texture on your fingertips? For me, there's nothing better. Are you one of those people who reads the last page first? Or do you start with the dedication page? Perhaps you flip through quickly and stop on the pages that look more interesting? Luckily, we have some excellent guides tonight who will provide a sneak peek into where you should start first when you open the pages of this new book. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This program will be made available on our YouTube page in a few weeks' time. You can check out our past programs on YouTube at youtube.com/railphotoart. You can also listen to us on your social media or visit us, listen, all the same. Visit us on our social media at railphotoart or on our website at railphoto-art.org. As a reminder, we use Zoom webinar for our presentations. This means that audience members do not have access to their personal audio or camera during the event. You can change how you view the presentation in the top right corner of your Zoom screen under the icon View. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of other icons. Please use the chat function for any comments you have during the presentation. By selecting everyone, you will ensure that the rest of the audience can see your comment. Tell us where you're joining us from and your favorite book about trains this year. I'll go first. I'm joining from Janesville, Wisconsin, and my favorite train book this year is Tony Reeves' O. Winston Link, Life Along the Line. Oh, whoops, I meant Burlington Spectacular STEAM Program. Please use the Q&A icon to submit any questions. Following the main presentation, we will be hosting a Q&A session. If you have a question at any point during today's presentation, make sure you post that in the Q&A, not to the chat, so that we can make sure and see it. I asked Scott Lothes for some help to introduce this program a couple of weeks ago. He wisely led me to Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, Travel. The last lines of the final stanza say, "Yet there isn't a train I wouldn't take, no matter where it's going." Because of our excellent guests tonight, Norman Carlson and Scott Lothes, we are lucky to jump on board with them and learn more about Burlington's Spectacular STEAM Program. Because of their combined experience and knowledge, I think we'll all be glad that we jumped on this train, no matter where it goes. Scott Lothes, I'm going to introduce Scott quickly, became the center's full-time executive director in 2011 after serving on its staff part-time since 2008. In 2013, he succeeded John Gruber as president and editor of the center's journal, Railroad Heritage. Fascinated by railroads from birth, Scott grew up watching coal trains in West Virginia. He took up photography while attending college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and graduated in 2002 with a degree in mechanical engineering. His photographs and articles appear frequently in magazines including Classic Trains, Railfan and Railroad, and Trains. Scott has edited and authored various books, including the topic of tonight's presentation, and my favorite book of the year, Burlington Spectacular STEAM Program. Since moving to Wisconsin in 2011, he has undertaken a project to document the railroads of the upper Mississippi River Valley, where he enjoys hiking and camping with his wife, Maureen, and their dog, Alma. Scott, I'll turn it over to you and Norm.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Lisa, for the kind introduction. And since this book technically hasn't been published yet, it's okay if it's not your favorite yet. We just hope it will be everyone's favorite by the end of the year.
Yeah, well, thank you.
I will go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get this train out of the station, and we'll try to keep it on the rails as well. All right. Is that showing up for everyone?
Looks great, Scott.
Okay, well then let's get this going. I'm going to start off and then turn it over to my co-conspirator, or I should say co-presenter in this project tonight. And you should know that this book started as an article for Railroad Heritage, but while we were working on that, we realized it was the kind of story that could become something more. So we're going to introduce the book tonight by showing you some of the photographs that are in it, along with some that aren't. And here's how to tell the difference. The photographs that Norm is going to share are in the book, And then the ones I'll be showing are some of my favorites that didn't quite make the final cut, except for this one, which is the cover of the book. That's the 5632 at West Burlington, Iowa, on a trip in 1963. This is a softcover book, 8.5 by 11, 80 pages, showcasing nearly 100 of John Gruber's photographs. Norm wrote the lead essay, and Justin Franz contributed additional text about the locomotives, one of the many characters involved in these trips, and then also the last run in 1966. And we are very grateful to the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society for supporting this project with one of their William D. Middleton research grants. The price of the book is $30 and they will begin shipping in November. You can pre-order these now on our website, that is railphoto-art.org/books, to take advantage of free shipping that we'll be offering through the end of November. And I'll have this slide back up at the end of the presentation as well. Now, the weather was very November-like in Aurora, Illinois for this doubleheader in early spring of 1963. This train would actually encounter snow later that day, and John used the raw weather to make some incredible photographs. This telephoto view includes much of the crowd, and it's an example of the photojournalistic approach that John brought to railroad photography, which at the time received some criticism. John gained notoriety for many things, including his telephoto work, but his telephoto work is really only half the story when it comes to his lens preferences. In addition to embracing telephoto lenses, John really eschewed the so-called normal 50mm lens, favoring both telephotos and wide angles. He frequently traveled with two camera bodies and two lenses, an 85mm and a 28mm. And we used a wide angle version of this scene in the book. But before we really dive into the STEAM program, I do want to take a few slides to give some context to railroading in the 1960s. John took all of the photographs that you're going to see here during STEAM excursions, and they show some of the incredible variety of equipment, interesting operations, and the varied infrastructure that was on display through the Burlington STEAM program. And these are F units at Galesburg in 1963. This was a railroad that was still using almost exclusively first-generation power. We have more F units inside the shop in 1960. And then E units held down nearly all of the passenger assignments. These are coming into Winona Junction, Wisconsin in 1960, and I just love that Burlington bus over there on the right. In-cab switchers worked the yard jobs and many of the local freights. This is an NW2 built in 1941, already 20 years old when John saw it in 1961. And then second generation diesels didn't really begin to show up until the later years of the STEAM program. This is a freight from May 1964 with a mix of Burlington and Union Pacific GP20s and GP30s. Now, the railroad still ran their own passenger trains, and the Burlington ran a lot of them. This is the combined Afternoon Zephyr Empire builder at Savannah, Illinois, in May of 1961, and John was waiting here for the 4960 coming back from Dubuque. Turning around here, he called a running meet, and that photograph is in the book. And here's the view looking the other way from the bridge at Savannah with the North Coast Limited heading up the Mississippi River later that summer in 1961. Today, this is part of BNSF's Northern Transcon route, and it hums with freight traffic, but in the early 1960s, the line hosted nearly as many passenger trains as freights. This was a different era of freight railroading, too. The main lines were still jointed rail, and many of the cars were 40 feet long. This is further up the Mississippi River with the 5632 in the distance, bringing a train back from St. Paul on Labor Day weekend of 1962. And the freights of the 60s still included cars like ice block reefers and outside braced wood boxcars. And John took this picture from the open gondola on the back of a steam trip with the 4960. And this is running over the Illinois Central in Dubuque, Iowa in 1964. And automobiles were beginning to travel by rail, and at the time they did so in open auto racks. And this is a westbound freight at Savannah, Illinois in 1961. And here's the caboose of that same train, still a fixture at the back of all freights, and a wood caboose, no less, with the 4960 sitting there on the eastward main. And this is a freight behind F3s on the main line between Chicago and Galesburg during a 5632 trip in 1960. This was all part of the railroading of the 1960s, and the Burlington's hundreds of steam trips provided unparalleled windows into this world for the hundreds of thousands of people who rode and witnessed them. The steam trips introduced railroading to the public, and along the way, they created quite a few railroad enthusiasts and railroad photographers. So, somewhat ironically, I think the steam trips also helped convince people like John Gruber that even without their beloved steam locomotives, railroading was still an interesting enterprise, one worthy of photographic study. And to me, that is a great legacy of the Burlington Steam program. Well, let's talk a little bit about that photography and specifically John Gruber's. That's John at age 30 in November of 1966. He's waiting here for CN steam locomotive 6218 a few months after the last Burlington steam trip earlier that year. John photographed at least 27 of the Burlington steam trips between 1957 and 1966, exposing more than 3,000 frames of 35 millimeter black and white film. We can see them today thanks largely to the efforts of one of our former interns and staff members, Abigail Guidry, who worked with us during the pandemic. She cataloged and digitized about 40,000 of the negatives in John's enormous collection. And John's photography came to us from his family. That is his son, Dick, who remains a great champion of our work. And behind him is his mother and John's wife, Bonnie. After John died in 2018, Bonnie spent 2 years sorting through and organizing his photography before donating it to us. Her extraordinary efforts have made our work so much easier. This is John's photograph of them on the last Burlington steam trip in July of 1966. Now, this is from the first Burlington steam trip that John photographed on September 1st, 1957, when Hudson Locomotive 3003 took a train from Chicago to Savannah and Galesburg and back. Other locomotives on display that day included 460, 637, an O-class Mikado, whose number I can't quite read, and then an NW2 diesel switcher. John was 21 years old at the time and already an experienced photographer, although somewhat limited by his gear. He used a variety of medium format and 35 millimeter cameras throughout the 1950s, but optically they all lacked some of the sharpness and contrast that really brought out his best work. John rode his second Burlington steam excursion on December 6, 1959. That was a trip behind the 4960 from Chicago to Ottawa, Illinois. And he had just gotten his first Nikon F camera, the first of several of that model that he would use for most of his life. This is a shot that nearly made it into the book. I love the crowd, the fire truck, the bikes, the photographers up there on the crossing signal at upper right. Ultimately, though, we realized that we had other photographs in the book that speak even better to all of those aspects of these trips, but I still like this one. Now, here's a great example of the power of using good gear. Here, John is looking south at Savannah, Illinois on May 1st, 1960. He's shooting almost straight into the late morning sun as Train 21, the Morning Zephyr, prepares to leave town ahead of the 5632, which was taking an excursion to La Crosse, Wisconsin. There's still plenty of detail in this backlit scene and even in the shadows, and most of the frame is tack sharp. I love this scene, but we ended up using a different shot also from here that was taken on top of one of those boxcars on the left. John was more than happy to climb whatever platform he could find for elevated vantages, and he never seemed to be deterred by bad weather. April 9th, 1961 was an absolutely dismal day in northern Illinois, and John got some incredible shots during 4960's trip from Chicago to Rockford and back. In the book, we used a shot on the turntable here at Rockford, but this view is nearly as good. I just love all the detail and people here. And here's another example of the power of steam in bad weather, and John's great use of the telephoto lens again. This is 5632 on the turntable at Galesburg in 1963. It's also a great example of the difficulties we faced in producing this book. We'd initially planned on 64 pages, but we expanded that to 80 as we kept finding so much great imagery. And now I kind of wish we'd found a place for this shot in the book too. I just love it. Now, some of these photographs have tremendous historic value. This is La Crosse, Wisconsin on October 5th, 1963. You can still listen to Packer games on 580 AM WKTY, but I think everything else in this picture is gone. This was the Burlington's original 1880s main line that ran right through downtown in the middle of 2nd Street. John was looking north at Pearl Street from about where the Holiday Inn now stands. John was always looking for opportunities for night shots too, favoring ambient light over flashes. Burlington steam trips frequently ran late and returned after dark, and that was the case on September 29th, 1963 at Galesburg, where 5632 was returning to Chicago after celebrating its 23rd birthday in West Burlington, Iowa. Now, if there was one other thing that John loved to do on these steam trips, it was to take panning or pacing shots to convey a sense of motion. This is 4960 rolling across the Illinois cornfields during a trip to Rockford on November 22nd, 1964. These kind of shots were difficult to pull off with manual cameras and no motor drives, but John's success rate was quite high. We didn't use this one in the book, but only because he gave us several other good options. Now, before I turn this over to Norm, I'm going to share a quick series of photographs from Buda, Illinois, taken on March 17th, 1963, when 5632 was running from Chicago to Galesburg. And I'm going to do this for two reasons. First, I think it's an interesting look at the railroad's operations, and then second, I think it provides some great insights into John's working methodology as a photographer, and I find both of those worthy of our consideration. Now, the first thing I had to do was figure out where this was. And that was a challenge with many of these photographs. John shot so much film that he typically only labeled the rolls with the date and then the trips to endpoints. Luckily, we had a lot of people help us identify photographs. We are grateful to them. I also spent a lot of time studying maps, timetables, and Google Earth. And lucky for me, there's only one place between Chicago and Galesburg where the Burlington goes through a town in a cut on a curve, and that's Buda. John was riding the train on this day, and he must have gotten off quickly and scrambled up to the Pine Street overpass, although he seems very soon to have decided that the State Highway 40 overpass in the distance would be the better spot. So this is the very next frame in the roll, taken from the Route 40 bridge. You can see the Pine Street overpass in the distance where John was standing previously. John made an excellent decision by relocating here. Because here comes 21, the Morning Zephyr, roaring by on the westward main past the steam train and the siding. This is the wide-angle shot. In the book, we used an earlier telephoto view with the engines almost side by side. John must have been pretty adept at juggling two cameras to get both shots with the Zephyr moving by at track speed. After 21 went by, John walked back down to track level and took a couple of detail views of the drivers. He was always looking for photographs at every opportunity. And since we know that freight follows passenger, here comes a mixed freight west running behind number 21 with a 2-year-old GP30 in the lead. It also had some Union Pacific GP30s in the consist and a wood caboose bringing up the rear. And then John turned around for a view looking back at the overpass with photographers up there as well. And then he stayed trackside as 5632 began backing up to perform a photo run-by on the westward main after those other two trains had passed. John went back to the bridge where serendipity nearly struck twice. This is train 22, the eastward edition of the Morning Zephyr, and you can see the smoke from the 5632 approaching in the distance. Sadly, the Zephyr was out of sight before the steamer came into view. The people back on the Washington Street Bridge must have won that round of photographic decision-making. But the run-by was quite impressive on its own, and I love that John kept shooting as 5632 passed right beneath him. What a rush of steam and steel. He turned around then for a going-away shot before scrambling back down to reboard the train. That was quite a flurry of activity at Buda, both on the railroad and for the photographer. I think just a great example of the kind of things that transpired on these trips. So it's about time for me to disappear into the sunset, much like 4960 was doing at Davis Junction, returning to Chicago from Rockford on December 16th, 1962. John had just shot the engine crossing the Diamonds with the Milwaukee Road, and here he turned 90 degrees to the south to record the scene as the train heads off into the distance. It's a simple view, and I love it, especially with that low winter sunlight raking across the gently rolling fields. Many photographers would have put down their camera after the engine passed, but John was always looking for the next shot. Now, this is not John's photograph, but it does show our next presenter when he was a little bit younger than he is now. Norm Carlson joined our board of directors in 2012, and we're sure glad he did. Norm spent most of his career with Arthur Andersen, where he became their worldwide managing partner for the transportation industry practice. I've lost count of the number of times that Norm has failed at retirement since then, but I know that one of those failures led to his serving a term as chairman of Metro's board of directors. Along the way, Norm has helped a lot of railroads figure out their accounting and a lot of nonprofit railroad museums figure out their accounting, as he's done for us. And that has been especially important through all of the growth that we've enjoyed at the center over the past dozen years. While Norm helps us stay out of trouble on the financial side of things, he sometimes helps us get into trouble on the programming side. That's the good kind of trouble, though, especially where railroads like the Burlington and the North Shore are involved. Norm, you should be the one to say more about that, so take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, for the gracious introduction, and I trust that you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Very good. This was my first trip. Obviously, we're in the cab of the 10-wheeler, 637, and this is at Ottawa, Illinois. This was on, I believe it was September 2nd, 1956. Hudson pulled the train from Chicago Union Station to Aurora. We then went down the branch through Ottawa, all the way down to Streator, came back up through LaSalle, Peru to Zering, where the 637 headed for Galesburg. I'm not sure how Dad found out about this trip, but Dad took me on all of the trips, and I have a suspicion it was the railroad marketing department. So with the next slide, this is Barstow. This is one of the rare occasions when a Hudson handled the mainline portion of the trip. That only happened a handful of times. Barstow was a junction near the Quad Cities. I remember this very well because of all the smoke, the people, and the curves that the train came around. On this trip, they backed the train from Barstow a good 10 miles, rough round, through the Quad Cities, all the way to the second railroad bridge over the Mississippi River, which I think is the Centennial Bridge. If we could go to the next slide. Whatever equipment was in the yard, the Burlington would put on the trains. This is the Omaha Club, so you can imagine being behind a steam engine on a heavyweight parlor car. The Burlington's attitude was, if the equipment is sitting in the yard, it isn't making any money, so if we can run an excursion train, we'll put as many cars on the train as we can. And the next slide is where my favorite place to ride was, and that is the baggage car right behind the train. I have a feeling this trip is along the Mississippi River because you can see the water in a dam in the background.
But it is. This was a Minnesota rail fans trip coming down from the Twin Cities.
That's very good. And you'd have a few cinders in your eyes after this, but that was part of the fun. Next slide, please. This is Maury Klebold, a character that you might equate to P.T. Barnum. He was a salesman, a marketeer, brilliant at figuring out how to run a fan trip, and the Burlington loved him. He knew the railroad as well as some of the people on the railroad. He knew what the Burlington would do and would not do. He would prepare the schedules, he would schedule the run-bys, and he would turn the schedule over to the railroad that basically just blessed them. And what the railroad liked the most about him is they agreed on a rate, they agreed on the count of the number of people based on the conductor's collection on the trains. They sent him an invoice, Maury paid immediately. So that's the reason why he was able to gain so many fan trips on the Burlington. He later moved, he was based in Champaign, Illinois, where the Illini Railroad Club was somewhat loosely affiliated with the University of Illinois, and it still exists today as a student organization for the railroad program at the University of Illinois. And he went on to run a travel bureau in San Francisco. Next slide. the run-bys were something else. And they you didn't need a platform. You just got off wherever the train stopped and you crawled across the right of way. And to the railroad, there was just another day on the railroad. Well, it wasn't quite that with all these people. And again, look at the consist of this. Look at the mix of heavyweight baggage cars, you name it, Vistadome cars, the whole 9 yards. And the run-bys were something else. And I also want to note that between Chicago and Mendota, US 34 paralleled the railroad. I mean, it was right next to the railroad. And the road was a 2-lane road. And many times when the train was running, cars were going west on both lanes. So there were some pretty heroic stops. And I don't know what the poor people did when we were coming east on 34, but that happened trip after trip after trip. Next slide, please, Scott. Again, this was an active railroad, yet look where all the people are. Let's move ahead, please. This was the countless times you would see kids being handed up, and it was almost like the crew, the engine crew, was grandpa, and that was their grandkids that they were taking out for a ride. I don't know how many kids ended up in the cab of these locomotives. And a very young Bob Campbell was up in the cab of a locomotive one day, and all of a sudden he felt the train backing up, and he witnessed the run-by from the cab of the locomotive. I guess they didn't care who was in the cab when it was time to start the run-by. So what was a run-by? We'll talk about that later, but here, next slide, please. Again, here are more kid shots. One of my favorite shots, if not my favorite Gruber shot, is the one on the right, with we assume are a brother and sister standing there, and the body language, and particularly the boy's hand up to his ear, is, what in the world is this monster? But the focus was on kids. Of the 266 trips, believe that number, 266 steam excursions that they ran, 83 were the choo-choo specials, which were just for taking school kids out for a ride and acquaint them what the railroad is. The president of the railroad was Harry Murphy. His idea behind the steam trips was he wanted to acquaint people with the Burlington Railroad, especially kids. So I think that he was thinking about his own grandchildren and the memories that he wanted them to take forward of what Grandpa was doing at the railroad. Next slide, please. This is the electrics. For one of the first electric interlocking, and this is at the east end of Mendota, and it is still referred to today as the electrics when you hear the dispatchers talking back and forth to the crews. This obviously is a double-headed run-by. Okay, so what was the run-by? They would unload the train, no platform, as I said before. They would back the train up over a mile. And in many cases, a curve was involved, as we saw in the Buda experience. And then you would hear two toots way off in the distance. The next thing is you see this cloud of smoke coming up, and all of a sudden the train would appear and would run by you between 50 and 55 miles an hour. They just pulled the throttle back as far as they could. And the train continued at that speed well past where all the fans were stretched out along the railroad, so that those who were taking movies could take a movie the entire train from front to rear. Then way off in the distance, you'd hear three toots and the train would back up slowly and the people would get on. All of this was done with a very active railroad going on. And really, the fans kind of self-policed themselves and looked out for each other to make sure that in most cases, and you'll see why I say most cases, you were reasonably away from the track. Next slide, please. Well, there were no coaling facilities anymore. So here we are, hand shoveling coal into the tender of 4960 and running a fire hose out to fill the water tank. You can imagine how long these exercises took to what we shall say is feeding the beast. But this is some of the trouble, it was trouble in many cases, that the railroad went to make everybody happy. And they did a superb job of that. Whether it was a train crew, the supervisors, and everyone along the way that was connected with the railroad, including the passenger agents that rode the trains to greet the public, it was a very, very fun experience. Harry Murphy must have said, we want this to be a fun experience. And I'll tell you, everybody on the railroad went out of their way, particularly in the Galesburg yard when you had the layovers while they were servicing the engines and turning the engines and train. And the foremen were in the roundhouses. They had a display line of steam locomotives. They were always available for questions and photographs. And if you wanted to take a photograph of yourself, you just handed the camera to one of the employees and they gladly took your photograph. This is one of the reasons why these trips were just so spectacular and so memorable. If you were on one of these things, everything was drilled into your mind and you remembered it forever and ever and ever. Next slide, please, Scott. Now, while this is a bridge over near the mouth of the Wisconsin River at Prairie du Chien into the Mississippi River, we're using this in lieu of a bridge in Illinois, at Oregon, Illinois, kind of just south of Rockford, southwest of Rockford, to tell a story about a train running from Chicago to Savannah. If you can believe this, now let's back up a second. This was ahead of the Morning Zephyr, train 21, which Scott referred to earlier. The train ran around 90 miles an hour as it went across Illinois, and it was a very hot train. And in those days, Burlington set speed records, and the trains had an annual magazine, had an annual survey, and the Burlington was at the top of the list most of the time. Well, a fellow by the name of Jim Conus was sitting next to trainmaster Charlie Abel when they came down into the Rock River Valley at Oregon, Illinois, and they kind of bounced when they hit the bridge over the Rock River. And they were flying across there, probably closer to 100 than anything else. So Charlie looked at Jim and said, something must be drastically wrong. So the minute they got to Savannah, he runs up to the engine and confronts the engineer and asked him what he was doing. So the engineer showed him his train orders, which said run ahead at 21. So the engineer looked at Charlie and said, do you think, well, you told me not to hold up 21, so we had to run fast to keep ahead of him. After a pause, Charlie looked at the engineer and said, nothing, and walked away. This is recorded in the article, and I think the more of the story is in there. I've kind of abbreviated for the purposes of this discussion. But the point is, the trains ran at 100 with 5632 and some of the Hudsons. They would be running between 80, 90, and 100 miles an hour. And I'll tell another story a little later about just that. Now, I said this is an active railroad. Look at how close the people are to the train, number one. And number two, he's probably doing around 50 miles an hour as he's going by them. Well, on one of these trips, somehow the word was passed not to get on the tracks because in the middle of the run by, the California Zephyr came eastbound at track speed. No fatalities, no nothing, and it's remarkable. I don't ever heard of any really serious injuries on any of these fan trips. It was people were just policing themselves and they were taking care of looking out and making sure everybody else was in a safe place. But this was one of the rare exceptions, but yet everybody seemed to be fine after it. Can you imagine this going on today? Next slide, please. Here is another view of why the trips were spectacular, or another reason why the trips were spectacular. This is the Mississippi River in the background. Again, notice the different cars in the different type of cars in the consist. And this was a run by, I believe. No, I don't think this was a run by. I think this was a chase. And I think that's probably Wisconsin Highway is a 34, Scott, that parallels the railroad. But there is
Highway
a
35 at the town of Victory, Wisconsin.
Yes, good, thank you. And but this is, this is just typical of what you saw. This particular photo is in Wisconsin, but this is on the 300-mile stretch where the Burlington was on the east shore of the Mississippi River, and in some cases on an embankment in the river. And if you can believe this, sometimes when tugs got in trouble and were trying to get out of trouble, the backwash from the tugs trying to move the barges or really get the barges started would derail a train. That happened on about 2 or 3 occasions to my knowledge. But anyway, the Burlington referred to this trip of 300 miles between Savannah and St. Paul as 300 miles where nature smiles. Next photograph. I have in my notes somewhere, but I've lost track of where they are. This is in Prairie du Chien, if I remember correct, Scott.
You got it.
And they're stopping opposite the Zephyr Bar. Notice the conductor talking to one of the passengers, dutifully outside the bar. And also, here we are, watering the locomotive with a fire hose. You can imagine how long this took with this engine. And some people were walking through the water as well as everything else. I mean, everybody was having a good time. But the purpose of this photo is to illustrate that the communities along the way became involved in the trips. And they would have a wonderful time along with the people. And everybody was just having one grand time on these trips. Another reason why they were spectacular. Next slide, please. I'm going to back up on another run by before we see this one. But coming on one day on a trip from Chicago to Galesburg, they had a Texas type locomotive out ahead of the 5632. The locomotive was so big it would not fit into Union Station, so they stopped at Clyde Yard, a short distance from Union Station, and put the Texas type on the front end of the train. Well, I think they were running the locomotive a little bit faster than what it's designed for, and it broke the eccentric rod on the left side of the engine out near Zering. That's west of Mendota. So from that point forward, the 5632 pushed this dead engine, this monster of an engine for Illinois side purposes, and pulled an 18-car train, I believe it was, to Galesburg. Well, obviously, we were a little late. And somehow out near Zering, they found a cutting torch from someplace, and they actually cut the eccentric rod so they could move the locomotive at any amount of speed. Well, you can imagine we were very late into Galesburg and even later coming east out of Galesburg. There is a long stretch through a small town called Waynette, Illinois, west of Princeton, Illinois, where the railroad crossed over the Rock Island Railroad. We came down that hill at least at 100 miles an hour with the throttle wide open, and I was in the baggage car hanging out of the door as much as possible. And the 5632 sounded more like a jet engine than a steam locomotive with the sound that we had at the speed they were going. The other thing was that the crews liked to entertain. So particularly the engine crews. So when we left, Aurora, and it was night mostly at this time, heading back to Chicago, they would open up the steam cocks on the locomotive, and they would take off, and vibration of the sound would bounce back and forth between the buildings on either side of the railroad in Aurora. Then you would approach LaGrange. Stone Avenue LaGrange Suburban Station is 7/10 of a mile west of the LaGrange Road Station, which is the main station in LaGrange. They would come approaching Stone Avenue at full speed and in 7/10 of the mile, stop the train with a locomotive cab on the south lanes of LaGrange Road. Well, people would get out of their cars to watch this as they're waiting for the train to unload and take off. When they would take off, or start up, I should say, the engineers would spin the wheels to give the effect to put on quite a show. And of course, you can imagine when the train was stopping with steel brake shoes on steel wheels, you basically had a little fire going at each wheel, and sparks were flying everywhere. It was quite a show when they would stop the trains at LaGrange Road. Well, unfortunately, this all came to an end. And would you believe you could ride in an open gondola? This is in East Dubuque with another train to St. Paul overtaking the train, and look at the size of the crowd. And it was an April day, so it was pretty chilly out there. 4960 was up ahead, and they would probably run somewhere between 40 and 45 miles an hour with people all in the gondolas. Can you imagine them doing this today in 2024? Well, the last trip was July 17, 1966. When I first saw this photograph, I broke out laughing with the Den Rock Zephyr. There is no such town as Den Rock. Den Rock is a railroad, or was a railroad junction with lines going in all four directions. The nearest town was Prophetstown, Illinois, and Prophetstown was near the town where Ronald Reagan was born. To give you some idea, it was in Western Illinois. Through what exists today through Den Rock, and those curves are still there, is the main line from Savannah to Galesburg that's used by the freight trains coming down from the Pacific Northwest to go into Galesburg to get classified. But again, here again is a open gun on the rear end of the train, and a sign that is almost hilarious just in its own making. The Harry Murphy retired. Lou Mink came to the Burlington as the new president. He immediately stopped the steam program. So on this trip, buttons were passed out that said Mink the Fink. And that brought the end to the fan trips. And with that, hopefully we have a little time for questions and Q&A. Oh, I forgot about this slide. If you can look at this carefully, there is the conductor on the backup move to turn the train at Den Rock, and he has the biggest smile on his face that you've ever seen in your life. And he has a big white flag in his hand to signal to the crew up ahead. The purpose of this, picking this slide, was to say at times the crew seemed to be having as much fun in the passenger agents as the people on the train. And it was, again, as I'm being repetitious, it was always fun to be on these trains. You always remembered the trip. You met friends, some of which became lifetime friends. And it was just an incredible, incredible experience to be able to ride these trains. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Well, we've got plenty of time for questions. And Norm, thanks so much for sharing those just wonderful memories. How many of the trips do you think you rode?
A good 10.
Okay. Well, I was obviously too young for the Burlington steam trips, but I have fond memories of the 765 in West Virginia, and I can tell you those mainline steam trips really do leave lasting impressions.
If I may, I had a cab ride in the 765 from Janesville back to Chicago on one of the trips on Metro in Wisconsin Southern. And as we rounded the corner at Rondout, the fireman hollers across the cab, 79. When the engineer steps up, grabs the throttle and pulls it all the way back, a whole bunch of junk goes up the stack and showered the people taking photographs. And Bishop Rassus was with me, and my wife Mary came down to see us go by the platform. And she said, all I saw was a lot of smoke, a loud whistle, and two hands as we went flying by. We went through Lake Forest at 74 miles an hour.
I bet those Burlington engineers had that had that motion of pulling the throttle all the way back down to an art on those 5632 trips.
They apparently did.
You didn't say anything about the food on board, the onboard food service. What was that like on the steam trains?
Well, they had a dining car. They had fixed menus. And more often than not, they ran out of food. I don't recall much of the food because I think I didn't pay much attention to the meal. It was anything to tide you over because I want to get back to the baggage car and hang out the door and listen to the engine and watch all the people along the right of way. And, you know, when you take all the people along the right of way, and, you know, Big Boy experience recently is a similar thing. You take all the people that rode the train, you know, it's countless, hundreds of thousands of people that witness these things. So to me, it's amazing. And even still today, as we saw with the Big Boy last month, a steam locomotive attracts all sorts of people.
Absolutely. When we had the Canadian Pacific Kansas City's 2816 came through in May, and I mean there were well over 100 people chasing that engine when it went west out of Chicago.
Do we have any questions?
We do. We have what was the one and please we welcome questions. Those can go into the Q&A feature of Zoom. One person asked what was the regular track speed in that area for passenger trains?
Well, I don't know what the timetable said, but I do know that they ran mainly around, they were in excess of 80 most of the times. You know, obviously certain speed restrictions, but in the Chicago area, they were limited to 70. But once they got beyond Aurora out of Chicago, they just really moved. And the interesting thing is the line across Illinois to Savannah was single track. It was double track, and I don't recall if it was CTC at the time, but it was clearly ABS, automatic block signal. But they moved, particularly on the line to Galesburg. The Denver Zephyr and the Colorado Zephyr really moved along. California Zephyr, I mean.
I know I've looked up those you mentioned the Trains magazine speed records, and I've looked those up as well. And as I recall, the stretch between Prairie du Chien and La Crosse, Wisconsin, had the fastest published schedules of any railroad in the country at the time, and I want to say it was right around 85 miles an hour for the Zephyrs to make their station stops between Prairie du Chien and La Crosse is how fast they would have had to average running.
Yeah, well, they were doing 100 to make that average work.
Oh, absolutely.
Or plus.
Yes.
So let me just an editorial comment. You know, when they talk today about running 110 miles an hour, we were doing that in the 1960s regularly.
Well, no, I mean, when I've given presentations in Wisconsin about passenger trains here, and of course, we're very excited to have the new Amtrak Borealis service and a second pair of Twin Cities trains running now. But those schedules are 7 or 8 hours, and back in the 1930s with coal-burning steam locomotives, they were doing those schedules in 6 hours. And Norma, Rich Tower asks, who was the CB&Q champion for this effort? And that would have been Mr. Murphy, would it not?
Yes, yeah, it was Harry Murphy.
Right.
who everybody, the words I hear the most, he was, quote, a common man that knew most people on the railroad by name.
Hmm.
And he lived in Aurora. He would take a regular commuter train in the morning, but he would ride the Denver Zephyr, which was the premier train on the railroad, back home in the evening.
Hmm.
And knowing railroaders of his type, that was not just a simple ride. That was an inspection of the train and the crew to make sure that the service level is what he expected of them. But he was I'm told he was highly respected by everyone on the railroad because of his railroad knowledge and his ability to talk to everybody and his recall of the names of just about everybody he ran into on a more or less regular basis.
We have another question too about the water stops. And do you have any sense for how involved the local fire departments were on those?
Well, they did, interesting enough on the water. I think they still had a working spout at Mendota because we always stopped there. And I think there was a working spout there, and there was a working spout at the west end of the Aurora station.
Yeah, I know we have pictures of both of those in the book.
Yes, and I don't recall, but there probably still was at Galesburg because they seemed to be able to
Yes.
return the train relatively quickly if they had to. But usually there was a long stop so people could tour the shops and take photos of the line of locomotives that they put on display. But it took a while. And but it was built into the schedule. It was just part of the day, and everybody was happy and enjoying the day and talking with just about everybody, and you made friends for the day. And as I said, in some cases you made friends for life who you travel with on the trips.
Hmm.
But everyone who rode them, has the same comment. They were spectacular, and we remember them well.
Hmm. Kevin Scanlon asks about the film that John used, and yeah, this was all 35 millimeter, everything we saw, and except for the first couple of shots, these were all taken once John got in his Nikon F cameras. And he did all of his own processing work. I know he developed film and maintained a darkroom in his basement for a number of years, and I think he printed a lot of his own work as well. Um, and as far as equipment, I think he would typically travel with two camera bodies. And I know he liked the 28 millimeter and the 85 millimeter lenses a lot. I think he used a 50 on occasion. And I think he also had eventually got a 200 that he used for some longer telephoto work, although that may have come after the Burlington shots. Um, but yeah, just a great example of what you could do with really kind of a limited range of focal lengths, but really knowing how to make the most of them. And then Norm David McKinley asks, what was the disposition of the locomotives that was used on these trips?
Oh, that's a heartbreaking question.
Yeah, especially for one of them.
5632 was at West Burlington in some degree of disassembly because the flue time had run out and the extension, I think they had two extensions or three extensions, had run out on the engine. And Mink stopped it. There was a fellow in Chicago by the name of Jansen, I forget his first name, who somehow, and he drove a milk truck as a profession, and I don't know how he got money, but he got control of the 5632 and a Grand Trunk locomotive. I think it was also a Northern, which I think was 5629 or some such number. Anyway, don't hold me to that off the top of my head. Well, they ended up being parked on the Chicago and Western Indiana, which was basically a switching railroad in Chicago, which also owned Dearborn Street Station. So it was the access for the owners of the CNIW to get into Dearborn Station. And he didn't pay the bills. And in an unauthorized action, after chaining the locomotive, this is the 5632, to the rails, they hauled it off to Erman House Scrapper. And I can remember seeing it sitting, as I drove west on 87, sitting in the yard. And one day Herman Howe just scrapped the locomotive
Hmm.
to pay the bills. And they didn't ask anybody, they just scrapped it. The 4960 still runs occasionally, and it's on the Grand Canyon Railroad, but they rebuilt the exterior so it looks nothing like what it looked like on the Burlington. So we have to look at the mics that are on display, one being in Mendota.
Right.
I think it's 4963. And then there's a number of 5600s, the 05s, that are stuffed and mounted in certain places around the country. And I think there's a Hudson in La Crosse, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And if you could only find someone who's got a few, maybe $5 million laying around that they know what to do with, if we could get a 5600 back into service in some place, that would just be nirvana for a whole bunch of us.
Hmm.
But that, it hurt even to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness we have the photographs. Oh, and we have Rich Gruber, John's son, tuning in tonight. Dick, thanks for joining us. And Norm, he asked if you know when the auxiliary water car was brought in to start using on the 4960 trips. Would that have been in the last couple of years?
I think it was, yes. I don't recall much of that. But as you can see what it took to water a locomotive.
Yeah, we could probably look through your dad's photographs too, Dick. I mean, he shot the trips in pretty much every year, so we could at least narrow it down to which year they started showing up. But I want to say it was in the 65 and 66 trips that I remember it. Lisa, if you're on and you can see any questions that have popped up in the chat, I'm not able to access the chat while I'm sharing my screen here. And if anyone else has questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's been actually really fascinating. A lot of people talking about where specific equipment is. Lou Gerard said that Dick Jensen bought the 5632 and that the 5629, Dave Schaff actually said is now at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Greg said that the 4978 is in Mendota and that the 4963 is at IRM. So people
That's
can
right.
go to the IRM to go see that locomotive. I'm going to have to pay attention next time I'm there.
Yeah, sister to the 4960.
Yeah, Lou also said that the first trip with the water tender was July 4th, 1963. So that adds a little bit of clarity there.
We asked the right crowd.
Yes, we did.
Thanks, Lou.
Yeah, well, Lou is the expert, and a lot of the text is due to Lou's recollections in an article he wrote for First and Fastest. So I'll get the plug in for that.
Good. Yes, another great publication.
And thank you. And the 637 is also at IRM.
Right. And I know there's a picture in the book of there was a doubleheader to Galesburg. They're servicing both engines and they're spotted, with the water plug in between them. And off in the distance on one of the garden tracks outside of the roundhouse is I think they pulled out the 4978 that day prior to it going to Mendota, where, is now on display. Well, if there's no other questions, we'd still be happy to take any. But the information there for purchasing the book is up on our website now. Again, that's at railphoto-art.org/books. These make wonderful Christmas gifts for the Burlington lovers in your life and the ones who just aren't fans of the Burlington yet and need to be. So you can help make a few more converts with your holiday gift shopping. And I do have a couple of reminders that Lisa was kind enough to pass along to me. Our next Zoom program is going to be on November 12th. That'll be back to our normal Tuesday evening time slot, and that's going to be interviews with some of our past scholarship recipients at the conference. We offer scholarships thanks to our conference patrons for young photographers and artists to attend the conference, make presentations, and we're going to check in with a few of those who received those in the past and see what they're up to now. And then speaking of the conference, the 2025 dates are now set. That's going to be May 16th through the 18th of 2025. We will have registrations for those opening after the first of the year, but prior to that, we'll be putting some more information and details out. But in the meantime, save those dates if you want to join us at Conversations 2025. Norm and I will be more than happy to sign any of the Burlington books that you wish to purchase and bring along for our pens. Norm especially, I think, should be doing that.
Scott, let me put my financial hat on for the organization and encourage any of you who are not members to please join our organization. I will tell you, I have found, and I've been on many not-for-profit boards, I have found being on this board with people like Scott, Bon French, Rich Tower, and others to be very rewarding. And maybe this is self-serving, but we have a wonderful board of directors with a great diversity of skills and talents and interest in art, variously in art and photography. And I just think that this is a great organization. And I just want to say that on behalf of myself and the others on the board.
Well, and thank you for that, Norman. We are funded primarily by our membership. All of you who are members help support our work, and we cannot thank you enough. So for everyone that is a member already, thank you. And if you're not yet and would like to be, there's information about that on our website as well. Well, otherwise, I think we will call that a wrap and look forward to seeing everyone back on November 12th for our next Zoom program. And we'll have another Zoom program in December, details to come about that. And then, of course, save those dates for Conversations 2025 on May 16th through the 18th.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott, and thanks everybody for participating. Norm, it was excellent. Thank you to you both, and we'll see everybody next time.
Night, everyone. Thank you.
Right.